Despite a relatively slow start to 2021, there were a ton of great cards released this year. We had Pot of Prosperity and Blazing Vortex, we had Diviner of the Herald and Drytron Mu Beta Fafnir and Lightning Overdrive, and in Burst of Destiny we had a bunch of crazy good cards like the brand new Sword Soul archetype and Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer. There were also a lot of good side set cards as well, so 2021 wasn't a complete waste for Yu-Gi-Oh! Even though the first couple of months weren't the best ones that we've seen in recent memory. Still, despite having many good cards, there were also some cards that did not live up to their original hype. In today's video, I wanted to talk about what I feel are the biggest flops of 2021 for Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, I do want to clarify here, as I always do when I talk about flops, for a card to be a flop, at least in my mind, it had to have had at least a little bit of hype. So we're not talking about like random commons here that no one's ever heard of. We're talking about cards that at least at one point people thought were going to be good, but they ended up being a lot less powerful than people thought they would be. Please keep in mind though that just because a card flopped does not mean that the card is bad, it just means it didn't live up to expectations. Anyway, the first flop that I want to talk about is the Warrock archetype, which first released in Blazing Vortex and then later on got support in Lightning Overdrive as well. This was a brand new world premiere archetype, so people knew very little about it, and I'll put this archetype on the bottom of the list in today's video because unlike the other cards in this discussion, no one was hyping up Warrocks once they saw any of their effects. This is a pretty big difference than the other cards in today's video because with Warrocks, people really hyped up this deck when they only knew the name and a couple of the card artworks. So that's pretty different from people seeing cards, reading their effects and saying, oh, these effects are going to be super powerful, and then they end up not being very good. For Warrocks, people didn't really think this deck was good once the effects were revealed, but I think that they were so hyped only on their name and a couple of their card artworks that I just have to include them in today's video because Warrocks really were one of the biggest flops of the entire year, and the only reason they're so low on this list is because we didn't really think they were good once we saw their effects. I think people are still holding out hope for the Warrock deck. You know, people think that the OCG is going to give them crazy support. I'm not even sure if you gave this archetype like 1 or 2 broken cards that it would be enough to make this deck good, but hey, we'll have to wait and see what the OCG comes up with. Next up, we have the brand new Reptile archetype in Ancient Guardians. Now this deck had a ton of potential. People really did hype it up quite a bit. People have been asking for a good Reptile archetype with graveyard effects forever now because of Snake Rain, and this looked like we were finally getting an archetype that could break that card. Not to mention a lot of the actual Reptile cards in this archetype looked pretty powerful. You had tons of graveyard effects that could special summon cards and then search cards and do stuff like that. The archetype even has an awesome like Foolish Burial card that could potentially be a Monster Reborn, and people did combine this deck with other archetypes and they made some pretty powerful combo plays. I think most notably, if you open like Alistair plus one of the level 4 Reptile monsters, you can do some pretty crazy things with that, but in tournament play, this deck ended up not being very successful. It saw a little bit of experimentation like the first couple of months after it was released, but ever since then it's been pretty much non-existent, even in casual play. I can't remember the last time I saw someone play this deck at locals. It was the best new archetype from Ancient Guardians, but that's not saying too much because the Pendulum deck, while interesting, ended up not being that impressive, and the Earth's Arctic cards were pretty much completely unplayable. So while this might be the best archetype out of Ancient Guardians, and while it might be one of the better Reptile decks in the game, especially in terms of which decks can abuse Snake Rain the most, sadly it wasn't quite good enough to be competitively viable. Next up, as much as it pains me to do so, I think we have to put Amazements on this list. Amazements were a pretty hyped deck on release. I think one of the bigger issues was that Lightning Overdrive was really struggling for value. Yeah, you had Diviner of the Herald, which was the big pull, but besides that, there weren't a ton of high valued cards, because let's be real for a second, if you weren't buying Diviner of the Herald or Drytron Mu Beta Fafnir, you probably weren't that interested in Lightning Overdrive. So I think because of that reason, people were willing to latch on to whatever deck was at least semi-competent, and that really was the Amazement deck. And while Amazements did see experimentation in decks like Guru and Trap Tricks when they were first released, at the end of the day, people did decide to cut them because they're not bad cards necessarily, but they don't really have a win condition and they don't really have a long grind game. So compared to other trap decks in the format like Eldritch or Altergeist or just pure Guru, this engine just wasn't good enough to compete. I think that it's not a bad engine by any means, but there's just not enough there to really build a deck around them. Next up, I'll say that all of the new cards in King's Court were pretty much giant flops. This was a big disappointment. I thought these cards had potential. A lot of people were hyped about them, and Konami even hyped up Joker's Knight to be as good as Magician's Souls, and I can see how they made that comparison because their summoning conditions are pretty similar, but man, this card is no Magician's Souls. For what it's worth, I think that Joker's Knight is actually a pretty good card, and I wouldn't be surprised if it saw play in the future. It's just a free warrior extender that adds itself back to the hand in the end phase. The big downside compared to other warrior extenders is that even though it does add itself back to the hand during the end phase, which is good for long-term value, it also requires you to play a Garnet, and there are a lot of warrior extender monsters that do not require you to play any sort of Garnet. So for that reason, I think Joker's Knight does have a lot of competition in terms of what extenders warrior decks want to play, but I still feel like this card might have potential sometime in the future. Before talking about the number one flop of 2021, I wanted to give one honorable mention to the Bee Trooper archetype. Now perhaps someone else would have put this archetype on the regular list, but personally I think this deck has done well enough to not be considered a flop. This deck did top a number of events, and it recently got second place at the EU Remote Duel YCS. So I think that Bee Troopers did well enough to not be considered a flop, even if they didn't live up to their potential because of how bad their Burst of Destiny support was. Finally, let's talk about the number one biggest flop of 2021, and in my opinion, as well as a lot of other people's opinion, it has to be Crossout Designator. How does a card go from being one of the most hyped OCG imports of all time, starting off at $120 to $130 for pre-sales, to $34 in just 3 months? That is pretty much unheard of for a card that was hyped this much, and we know this card is good. You know, this card saw tons of play in the OCG, so people were very excited for it in the TCG, but it turns out, maybe even more than people anticipated, not having Max C in the TCG format really does hurt Crossout Designator quite a bit. I don't remember a time when a card was this hyped and ended up flopping this fast. I know I talked about Crossout Designator flopping a few months ago, and people back then were telling me I was way too early to say the card wasn't good, but since then the card has gone down in price even more and it's seen even less play. It's a real disappointment considering how much people really wanted this card in the TCG. Crossout is not a bad card, and it has topped a number of different events and a variety of strategies, but it's nowhere near as overpowered as people thought it would be, and it's definitely not a staple 3 of in every deck like it is in the OCG. So Crossout was definitely the most overhyped card in the entire game of 2021, and for that reason it was the biggest flop of the year in my opinion. Let me know in the comment section below though what cards or archetypes I missed in today's video. What other things were big flops in your opinion? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. I'll see you later though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.